Hey guys, welcome back. We are diving into chapter 7 today. Ooh, it's getting a little difficult. It's getting difficult. Why is this chapter so hard? There's so much information about the revolution. Let's dive in. Who are the proles? We're going to start with them first. We learn all about these three things today. Here's what we're going to focus on. Who are the proles? The proles are the masses of people who aren't part of the party. They aren't part of this privileged party class. They're more of just all the working class and the masses that represent most of Oceania. And they're really portrayed as inferior, people that the party needs to keep in control. Number two, we're going to learn the party's version of the story behind the revolution. This is how the party gained power, right? They got rid of whoever was in charge before. And but the party likes to give its own version of the revolution to show that it was necessary, that they needed to do it, and that life is better now because of it. And something a little bit more cryptic and almost like a riddle. 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's the truth, right? But what if someone could convince you that 2 plus 2 equals 5? This gets into this whole theme of what is the truth? And can people convince you of things that is not the truth? Well, when you see it like this in a mathematical equation, it seems so obvious. 2 plus 2 equals 4. But when does 2 plus 2 actually equal 5? Sometimes. Let's dive in. So why does Orwell use the word proles? We have to dive into this because prole is short for a word, the proletariat. Now, the proletariat is a fancy word for the working class person. And during a very tumultuous time called the Russian Revolution, a very famous man named Karl Marx believed that communism is inevitable because there's a class struggle between the working class and the capitalists. Capitalists are the owners of businesses and the privileged rich people of the Industrial Revolution, where the working class are basically like slaves to capitalists. And this is what Marx believed. And he believed that since the proletariats are so oppressed, they're pushed down by these industrial giants called the capitalists, the people who say, hey, you have to work 10 hours a day and I get all the profit and you get, minimum wage. Marx believed the proletariats are only going to take that for so long, and they're going to rise up, get rid of the capitalists, and eventually create a society that has no class system. There's no high class and low class. We're all one. That's what communism eventually strives to be. So before the revolution, we have lower classes oppressed by this industrial revolution because the industrial revolution is run by capitalists who take all the profit and they leave the proletariats and the working class um, in the worst conditions like slaves. And there's other people that are oppressed, right? Farmers, military, anybody in the lower class. This is what the Russian Revolution, these are the people who rose up. And the smart, intelligent philosophers of that time led the proletariats through this Russian Revolution. After the revolution, these smart revolutionaries promised to free all the proletariats and all the lower classes, the working classes, from their slavery. But what we want to figure out is, did they just become slaves to a new master? Did the revolutionaries just become the new masters? And power really just cycles, and whoever's in power abuses their power and makes everybody else slaves. So we're going to think about how the party, paints this picture of the revolution being so great, but we want to ask ourselves, is 1984, is Orwell saying that the proles are they were worse before, they were bad before, and now they're equally as bad. But the revolutionaries promised that they are free, and so now the proles think they're free. But are they really free? So the proles, short for proletariat, the working class, are really just the masses, and they're portrayed in 1984 as well as portrayed by the party as the mob. They're ignorant of politics. They lack education. They're trivial. The things they talk about and that they fight over are trivial. They don't care about the things that Winston cares about, right? Like freeing everybody from bondage. The proles are really just going about almost like animals. And that brings me to our first activity. Now we're going to go and do a deep dive into how proles are described, portrayed, and represented in 1984. But I want you guys to do an activity first where we're going to find some quotes about proles. So let's go to week 24, 1984 activity. We're going to go to activity number 1. So here we are. What I want you to do in chapter 7, you're going to find as many examples of proles being described as animals or being described as inferior. Inferior means you're less, you have a lower intellect, you are not seen as worthy, as people who are more superior than you. You're going to copy those below in this box, as many as you can. And when you're done with that, you're going to answer a question in 2 to 3 sentences that's going to require some critical thinking. Why does the party compare proles to animals? Why does the party see the proles as inferior? Why is it important for them to be seen as inferior to the party? I'm going to give you 10 minutes to complete this, and when you're done, we'll move on together and talk about the proles in more detail. I'm sure you noticed this amazing introduction to this chapter. If there is hope, wrote Winston, it lies in the proles. So here we keep thinking that the party is portraying the proles as people who are inferior, animals. They can't think for themselves. They need other people to control them. But Winston has a different idea. Winston says, nope, nope, nope. The proles are the answer to taking down Big Brother. Why? It must lie in the proles. And remember, Winston's writing this in his diary. Keep this in mind. It's very symbolic, right? He's not telling this to anybody. He's writing it secretly so the thought police don't get to him. Remember, in his diary is the place where he can finally think for himself. So he's jotting down all these things in his diary. If there was hope, it must lie in the proles because only there in those swarming, disregarded, right? The party doesn't even think of them as human masses, 85% of the population of Oceania could the force to destroy the party ever be generated. They are the manpower. Strength in numbers. You've probably heard that phrase before. So why is it that the proles could easily rise up against the party? But why don't they? I mean, you can ask this of any country that has a dictator that's tyrannical, that abuses their power. Why don't they just rise up? That's the issue because the people in power are able to keep the proles or the masses in check because they feed them lies. Oh, you guys are better than ever. You guys are living great lives. You guys are not smart enough. You need us to help secure you and to make sure you have enough food to eat and this and that. But Winston's starting to see through that. He's starting to see that they only need to rise up and shake themselves like a horse shaking off flies. If they chose, they could blow the party to pieces tomorrow morning. So, how are the proles really portrayed? I just wanted to take a look at some of the quotes. I'm wondering if you guys noticed any of these quotes. But simultaneously, true to principles of doublethink, the party taught that the proles were natural inferiors who must kept in subjection like animals by the application of a few simple rules. And it worked. Even though they don't really know anything, the party doesn't know anything about the proles. They just keep them at a distance and keep them feeling like animals, and keep them feeling like they are just instinctual bandits, thieves, drug peddlers. Um, as the party slogan put it, proles and animals are free. So they're trying to show that animals and pearls are the same thing because that's what that equation means. But also like, oh, they're free from the hardships that they used to undergo before the revolution. People in power are like, oh, I wish I was a pearl. I could just be free, right? But that's just some reverse psychology. To keep them in control was not difficult. All you do is you spread a couple little thought police around. But all that was required of them was a primitive patriotism, which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations, right? So they're the manpower behind Oceania. And the party needs them to be able to work and do whatever they want. And they need them to be able to stop eating so much so that the people in the party could eat more. Um, and this is how the people in power are able to live relatively better lives than the proles because the proles are working their butts off and they're being convinced that, oh, I'm working for my country. One interesting thing is that Winston says until they become conscious, they will never rebel. But what that implies is that they're not conscious. They're just almost like little bacteria going around with no brains. This is how they're portrayed. Why do they have to be portrayed like that? Why is that so important to the party? And that brings us to another thing that happens in the chapter where Orwell talks about, or the Winston talks about the party's version of this story behind the glorious revolution that got them all to where they are today. Now, the party's version of the history behind the revolution is a very Marxist history. Remember, I told you Karl Marx, he was a famous philosopher and economist, and he suggested that the world is all heading towards communism. And the reason is because people can only be treated like slaves for so long. They're going to rise up, and then they're gonna create a revolution that will create this perfect utopian classless society. And it's all based on this idea of class struggle, rich versus poor. This is the cornerstone of the party and Marxist philosophy. Before the revolution, we had rich versus poor. Now, after the revolution, everyone's equal. Before the revolution, we had capitalists, right? Rich people who owned the businesses and told all the working class what to do, versus the working class, the proletariats, who were subjected under terrible conditions and had no freedom and no rights and no ability to speak. And again, it all comes down to oppressor versus oppressed. Person who's using their power to abuse people and exploit them, and the people who are the victims. You see this divide between rich versus poor, capitalist versus proletariat, oppressor versus oppressed. This is what the party tells itself is what was happening before the revolution, and this is why they needed to have the revolution. And this is characterized in a quote that Winston says, when an ordinary person spoke to a capitalist, he had to cringe and bow to him and take off his cap and address him as sir. So that's the before the revolution. Before the revolution, this is how people had to act. Now, this is not Winston saying this. Winston is recalling what the party says in its history books. So the party really wants everyone to believe that before the revolution, we had this elite class. And thank God that the revolution came and that the people in power in the party are in power now, and we don't have this terrible, terrible divide anymore. But we have to ask ourselves, is this true? Why do they have to keep up this narrative as if their whole lives depended on it? Is it true that everybody's lives are better off than before? Doesn't seem so. Let's take a look. So it says he reached down and scratched his ankle again. Don't forget, he's got this ulcer down on his ankle that he keeps scratching. And I think it's very symbolic of there's something lying underneath that's just waiting to get out. And he's scratching and itching this thing because he's got to keep everything hidden. So I think every time he scratches his ankle, it's this symbolic, metaphorical idea that something's just waiting to be unearthed and he can't keep it down any longer. Day and night, the telescreens bruised your ears with statistics proving that people today had more food, more clothes, better houses, better recreations, that they lived longer, worked shorter hours, were bigger, healthier, stronger, happier, more intelligent, better educated than people of 50 years ago, right? That'd be before the revolution. They have to keep up this narrative. Not a word of it could ever be proved or disproved. Okay, so nobody knows really what the truth is. I mean, any statistic, if it's coming from someone in power, can be made into a science. Yes, this is backed up by science. Yes, this is backed up by economics. This is backed up by statistics. This is, of course, Orwell's point about how do we trust anything that people say. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The eraser was forgotten, and the lie became truth. But what was interesting is the people who had started this revolution, they were actually very, noble in their ideas of wanting to get rid of these capitalists so that there could be more equality. But really, the story really begins when the original leaders of the revolution were wiped out. So the people who had started the revolution, they were actually vaporized themselves because Big Brother, the person who wanted power, he wanted power under the disguise of the revolution, even though he didn't really care about the revolutionary ideals of equality and not being slaves anymore. Well, Big Brother, he still wanted everybody to be slaves, but he used the revolution as a way of saying, like, yeah, I'm with the revolution, woohoo. But really, he just wipes out all of the leaders. And Winston has this memory of these three men who were part of the party but had been arrested. And this is a very interesting story here. It shows the quick betrayal of people who have power, people who think like, "Oh, I'm in the party. I have, I've been loyal this whole time. I've been a good person." But it doesn't matter any of that. What matters are the whims of Big Brother, whatever he wants to do at that moment. So Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, Winston remembers them because they were arrested for conspiracies. And if you guys remember, there's a word called scapegoat. Scapegoat is when you blame someone for all of your problems and it makes you feel better about yourself. Or people use a scapegoat to manipulate, for example, the masses. So Big Brother will go to the proles and say, "Oh no, Goldstein is at it again. He's been doing X, Y, and Z, and you guys need to make sure you follow what I say, or else he is going to be in power, and we don't want that." And so it's really easy to use scapegoats. So they might use a counter revolutionary, someone who has been engaging in conspiracies to get Big Brother out of power. And that's what happens with Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. And all of a sudden, they had these confessions. They had these confessions that said, "Yeah, we did all of these conspiracies. Yeah." And of course that they were then vaporized. But Winston remembers something that triggers the sense that maybe they did not tell true confessions, and maybe the confessions were actually um, forged and the confessions were actually false. Let's take a look. So he sees them at the cafe. A little later, all three were arrested. It appeared that they had engaged in fresh conspiracies from the very moment of their release. At their second trial, they confessed to all of their old crimes over again with a whole new string of new ones. They were killed, executed, and their fate was recorded in the party histories, a warning to posterity, to all the children who come along. About 5 years after this, in 1973, Winston was unrolling a wad of documents which had just flopped out of the pneumatic tube onto his desk when he came on a fragment of paper which had evidently been slipped in among the others and then forgotten. The instant he had flattened it out, he saw its significance. It was a half page torn out of the Times about 10 years earlier, the top half of the page that included the date, and it contained a photograph of the delegates at some party function in New York. And then it was the three men. There was no mistaking them, right? Their name was on it. The point was that at both trials, all three men had confessed that on that day that they were on Eurasian soil, right? They were in Oceania. But in New York, we know is not Eurasia. That's going to be in America. They had flown from a secret airfield in Canada to a rendezvous somewhere in Siberia and had conferred with members of the Eurasian General Staff, to whom they had betrayed all of their secrets, right? But no, there's something wrong. There's a lie about where they were that date. The date had stuck in Winston's memory because it chanced to be Midsummer's Day. But the whole story must be on record in countless other places as well. There was only one possible conclusion, that the confessions were lies. Okay, so even at that time, Winston had not imagined that the people who were wiped out in the purges had actually committed the crimes they were accused of. Obviously, Big Brother was just using their confessions as a way to show, hey, these people are trying to conspire against us. We need to really hunker down, consolidate our power. But this was concrete evidence. It was a fragment of the abolished past, like a fossil bone which turns up in the wrong stratum and destroys a geological theory. It was enough to blow the party to atoms, if in some way it could be published. And he had gone straight on working, right? He's trying to figure out a way in his diary how he's going to use these things like photographs and information, maybe to meet up with O'Brien so that he could reveal all these things about the party. Which gets us to our final part of the story. He's talking about potentially going to O'Brien with all of this information, and he knows that he has this truth. And this truth from things like photographs, from his memories, allows him to say that freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows. So as we were discussing our little symbols here, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is the truth. This is what Winston knows to be true from the photograph, from his memories. But the party wants you to believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5. And they're really good at doing this. And so Winston has to prove throughout the story that 2 plus 2 actually does equal 4. And that's his mission. And that's what freedom means to him, is being able to decide mathematically, objectively what is true without being manipulated by people in power. Of course, that was a tough chapter. It is a tough chapter. I encourage you to actually go back and read it again. Now that we have discussed some of these ideas about the Russian Revolution, please go and Google the Russian Revolution, which is always has been an inspiration for Orwell's work. And read Karl Marx as well. If you just look him up on Wikipedia or on Google about communism and what he believed about the proletariats versus the capitalists and why the revolution took place in the first place. But then everything went downhill. So your homework this week is going to read chapter 9. You're going to skip chapter 8. We're just, kind of moving along, and this is going to be your last reading for this series. Your homework is going to be to work on your fictional story. This is your last week to work on that as well.